All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's about 2:02, so we'll get started and I'll stall for a little bit in the beginning here to give people an opportunity to sign on. Thank you so much for joining us for the Oregon Department of Energy's public hearing on our application to the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Resilience Program. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Janine Benner and I'm the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. Today's meeting is to specifically discuss a program created in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act under Section 40101D. This is different from the request for information put out yesterday by the U.S. Department of Energy. That's for additional funding that will be made available for similar activities to strengthen the country's electric grid, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion this afternoon. Because of the format of this webinar and the number of people in attendance, we have everyone muted currently. But as we go through the presentation, we'll pause for questions. And at that point, we'll be able to unmute individuals to ask questions. I'm going to jump ahead to talk about the agenda in just a moment. But as I do, I would ask ODOE staff who are on the call to please introduce yourselves in the chat. And next slide, please. So for those of you who are new to WebEx, here's a quick guide on how to use some of the features. As I mentioned before, attendees are going to be off camera and muted, but our host will be able to unmute you if we call on you to ask a question. You'll see the option to raise your hand on both the right-hand side of your screen under Participants panel. If you click near your name, you should get the opportunity to raise your hand. And there's also an option at the bottom of your screen where you can see a visual of a hand in the reactions bar. So feel free to use the chat function to ask questions or make comments. When you do that, make sure to send to all panelists or everyone so that all of the ODOE staff can see it and help respond. If you just send it to the host, it's hard for the one staff person who's the host to be able to see everything. And we'll try to get to as many questions in the chat as we can and through raised hands, but we may not have time for all of them today. I noticed that some people have called in on the phone. If you have and you would like to ask a question, you can press *6 to raise your hand and *3 to unmute yourself when we call on you and the host unmutes you from our end. I want to make sure that you know that today's hearing is being recorded, and we also plan to post a list of attendees to our website later today because I know it's hard to see the other people who are in attendance. All right, next slide, please. We have a lot to get through today in our 2 hours together. Here is the agenda. For the first part of today's meeting, we're going to be focusing on the grid resilience funding opportunity in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the way that Congress and the U.S. Department of Energy have structured the program and the requirements for the Oregon Department of Energy on behalf of the state to submit an application. My colleague Jen Senner, who is our federal grants officer, will be leading this part of the presentation. The second part will be information about the state's approach to our application. My colleague Adam Schultz, who is the lead of our electricity group and the Planning and Innovation Division, will be speaking about the specifics of the Oregon program. And finally, towards the end of the agenda, we will look for your feedback on the state's approach. And I'll say again, we'll stop and ask for questions during the presentation, and you're welcome to ask them and put questions in the chat. But please know that many of your questions will probably be answered as we go through the material, so you may also want to save them to the end. My colleague Ruchi Sadir, Associate Director for Strategic Engagement, will be helping to keep an eye on the chat as we go through the presentation. And finally, my colleague Stacy is our host today, and she'll be helping to keep an eye open for questions as well. All right, next slide, please. So before we jump in, a quick introduction to the Oregon Department of Energy, or ODOE, as you might hear us referred to. On this slide, you will see our vision, mission, and what we do. Our mission is to help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. Under what we do, you'll see the services that we provide and how we achieve our mission. The funding opportunity that we're discussing today will help ODOE support a resilient and affordable energy system. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have 4 key objectives for our time together today. First, we want to make sure that you understand how this grid resilience funding works and the parameters that we have to work within when designing the state's program. This is a huge opportunity to bring federal dollars to Oregon to help make our electric grid more resilient. Second, we want to share with you our approach for this funding and what we're planning to put in our application to US DOE. This approach has been developed over the past 2 months in close consultation with the Oregon Public Utility Commission and is informed by some initial outreach with experts working in this space. I think that you may hear some feedback from my microphone, and I apologize for that. I'm literally having resilient solar panels installed on my roof today. We've been waiting to do this for a while, and the installers are finally here, and I'm sitting right under the place where they're installing solar panels. So I apologize for the feedback, and I'm going to be turning it over to a colleague soon, so hopefully you'll be able to hear better. But I'll just get through this slide, which is to talk about our objectives today. And this is our opportunity, in addition to sharing information, to hear from you on the program design and application, and to get your ideas for how to improve it. Now, remember, the draft proposal that we're sharing with you today is literally just that. It's a draft. We want your input and feedback to make it better, to align with work already being done by utilities and others, and to better meet the objectives outlined in the federal funding opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, we will have some time for verbal public comments at the end, and we also hope people will submit written comments through our online portal if you don't want to today, or you don't get a chance to speak, or if you have more to say. And finally, you'll hear today that our approach to this federal funding is in phases. This is a 5-year program, and we're proposing a preliminary approach for year 1 and the launch of a conversation about more permanent objectives, criteria, and metrics for years 2 through 5. All right, next slide, please. And now I will turn it over to Jen Center to talk about this federal funding opportunity.
Yes, the federal funding opportunity that we have before us today comes to us through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, you can see that it provides $62 billion for the U.S. Department of Energy to deliver a more equitable, clean energy future for the American people by investing in American manufacturing and workers, expanding access to energy efficiency and clean energy for families, communities, and businesses, delivering reliable, clean, and affordable power to more Americans, and building the technologies of tomorrow through clean energy demonstrations. And this is just part of the suite of funding opportunities that come to us from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Included in that, we also are anticipating funds through the State Energy Program, funds through energy efficiency programs, including a revolving loan fund and energy efficiency and conservation block grant programs. In addition to those funds, the state of Oregon is anticipating receiving approximately $30 million in weatherization activities that will be run through the Oregon Housing and Community Services Agency. The Oregon Department of Transportation is also anticipating roughly $50 million to invest in the construction of electrical vehicle charging stations. The program we'll be discussing today relates to resilience and reliability. So that is approximately $50 million to the state of Oregon over a 5-year time period. In addition to that, there may be competitive opportunities to assist with workforce program training opportunities related to energy auditors and building codes. But today, our focus of this public hearing is all about the opportunity before us related on resilience and reliability to the electric grid. Overall, we're working on establishing guiding priorities based on feedback that we received in July to help us as we direct the investments under all of these different opportunities under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I want to start by thanking those who took the time to participate in either one of those two webinars or provided your information through the comment portal. We're working through that at this time to come up with our guiding priorities. Although it's not finalized, we do recognize that under the IIJA funds, it will be important for us to consider equity at every step, to facilitate regular communication, and to provide technical assistance to build both community capacity and support grant recipients. These are some of the priorities we've applied in the development of this proposed grant narrative that we'll be discussing today, and they will be reflected even further as we move forward in future years under this program. So at this time, I'd like to pause to find out if we happen to have any questions that may have come in so far, or if anyone has their hands raised.
No questions in the chat so far, Jen.
All right, we'll go ahead and move along. So the funding opportunity that brings us here today and the purpose of these funds, as outlined by the U.S. Department of Energy, is to improve the all hazards resilience of the electrical grid against disruptive events. It's also to generate the greatest community benefit in reducing the likelihood and consequences of those events, and to advance the Department of Energy's equity, environmental, and energy justice priorities, including the Justice 40 initiative. In pursuit of all of that, it provides opportunities to invest in the American workforce. A little bit of timing information regarding this opportunity. For the state's application that opened up on July 6th, and we've been working on preparing the proposed narrative that we'll be going over in depth today. But our application will be due to the U.S. Department of Energy on September 30th. And just to clarify that the Oregon Department of Energy will be the entity, the agency for the state that applies, receives, and administers this particular set of funding. So how this works in context is there's really a sort of a two-step process. States, tribes, and territories will be able to apply to the federal U.S. Department of Energy to receive funds. And under the intent of those funds, states in particular have to propose methods and criteria under which we will invest these dollars to further the goals of the program. And we'll do that through a grant-making program to eligible entities. And so as a state, we'll be making grants to the eligible entities that will be described a little bit. The funding opportunity announcement permits these eligible entities to be amongst this list and could provide some flexibility for future years as well. And so essentially it'll be a two-step process where the state will receive the funds, and then the vast majority of those funds will be granted out even further within the state. So under this funding opportunity announcement, we do have some information regarding our allocation, at least for the first year of the program. And so Oregon's allocation is just shy of $10 million. As you can see, the specific amount there. And we do anticipate an allocation to continue each year for a 5-year period. The overall amount of how much Oregon was set to receive is part of a 5-part formula that the U.S. Department of Energy has provided and may be refining in years to come. In addition to the federal funds that are available under this opportunity, there are also requirements of match dollars. And in the just to provide a little context of what match dollars means is essentially it's funding that a state or tribe as the applicant to the U.S. Department of Energy would need to provide to align with the scope of this work so that they are able to bring in those dollars to show that they're contributing as well to the project. And for states and tribes, the match requirement is 15% of the federal funds. So for Oregon, what that translates to is just a little shy of $1.5 million for the first year. In addition to the match requirement for states and tribes, there is additional requirements that subrecipients of the funds, so the eligible entities that will be receiving the funds to really do the investment work under this, will also have to contribute matching dollars towards the scopes of the project. So in the subrecipient match, that will be based on the size of the eligible entity, and that's based on their sales of electricity per year. And so you can see the threshold there is 4 million megawatt hours that basically if an entity is above that, they have to provide match at 100% rate. And if they are below that, they have to match at a rate of 1/3 of the federal funds. So what these dollars can do, these dollars are able to be invested in quite a suite of eligible measures, everything from weatherization technologies and equipment to utility pole management to adaptive protection technologies and the replacement of old overhead conductors and underground cables. This list of eligible activities is inclusive, so it's not fully exhaustive of everything that may be conceived under these applications or under this program. But there are a few things that is expressly prohibited to be used, that these dollars cannot be used for. And those are listed at the bottom of the slide here. It's resilience measures cannot include construction of a new electric generating facility or a large-scale battery storage facility that's not used for enhancing system adaptive capacity during disruptive events or cybersecurity. With these funds, since they are federal in nature, there will be federal requirements that apply to all of the projects. And these requirements involve regular reports on financial status, project progression, and metrics. And in addition to that, there are various terms and conditions that potential applicants may want to familiarize themselves with. Those include the Davis-Bacon Act requirement for workers, the National Environmental Policy Act, Build America, Buy America Act, and just the general understanding that these projects are subject to monitoring and audits by both the Oregon Department of Energy and the US Department of Energy. And this is not a fully exhaustive list of all the terms and conditions, but that will be available in the future. So with that, I'd like to see if there are any additional questions that have been raised.
Thanks, Jen. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, and there are no hands up at this time.
Thank you. All right.
Great. Thank you, Janine and Jen. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to now walk you through some of the core elements of our draft proposal that we intend to submit to US DOE at the end of next month. So before I get started, as been mentioned a few times already, I just want to keep in mind that this is still a draft proposal. What we have here, what we're going to walk through is not set in stone, and we really are still looking for feedback and input. So keep that in mind as you hear the elements we propose. So for year one, really looking at a provisional approach. What we're proposing for the first year of the 5-year program should be thought of as provisional and targeted. Why? We have a short timeline to stand this program up and get an application to US DOE by September 30th. So again, thank you for your contribution so far, and again today, and in written comments you may submit for helping contribute to this. Another reason for this is the diversity of investment types. So you saw the long list of eligible investments that can be funded by this program. And then that's a complicating factor for us. How do we compare undergrounding a power line near Mount Hood with a microgrid in Medford with the need for more extensive vegetation management outside of Bend? In many ways, these types of investments are apples and oranges, and comparing them competitively would require a thoughtful, complex scoring system to identify varying levels of community benefit with each investment. So instead, for year one, here's what we're focused on. Administrative efficiency, not just for ODOE, but also for our applicants. We're seeking to invest in actionable utility projects that are ready to go. And we're looking to commit all of Oregon's allocated funds so we leave nothing on the table. Otherwise, US DOE can recapture those funds and have them go to other states. And then importantly, also taking the time in year one, and we try to lay out a thoughtful approach in the narrative to convene stakeholders to inform a more robust, nuanced approach for years 2 through 5. So for those future years of the program, what we're really looking to do is have a process to identify a stakeholder advisory committee in year one that can inform the development of objectives and metrics for those future years to prioritize projects that are identified by and located within disadvantaged communities in alignment with the Justice 40 initiative, that address multiple grid disruptions associated with multiple hazards, so not just wildfires, as is our focus for year one. And then also that aligns with mitigation strategies identified by the state's energy security plan, which is just really beginning and is in progress, and with other efforts in the state, such as the IOU's clean energy plans that are underway at the PUC. Next slide, please. So let's dig in a little more on our proposed provisional approach for year one. The preliminary objectives we've identified for year one. So first, around wildfire, as we've mentioned, we really want to focus on making investments in wildfire risk mitigation, either in areas of the state recently impacted by wildfire or those areas that are at high risk of wildfire. Two, really focusing on community benefits. So maximizing benefits by addressing projects that either address that wildfire risk or locating projects in disadvantaged communities. Also identifying projects that are ready to go. So we're looking to support investment in projects that are really ready to go and can deliver immediate community benefits. So this is an area I'd mentioned that we're really looking for some feedback. What's the best way for ODOE to evaluate that a project is really ready to go? So I'd be curious to get input from utilities on that. Labor, as a requirement to the funding, we're looking to invest in projects that meet strong labor protections and standards. And then again, as I hinted on the previous slide, really looking at preparing ourselves for years 2 through 5 with designing objectives and metrics that address a more robust set of criteria. Next slide, please. Now let's talk a little bit about the funds that will be available. As Jen mentioned earlier, Oregon's formula allocation of funds is expected to be just shy of $10 million per year, or roughly $50 million over the course of 5 years. There's also that 15% state match, which Jen mentioned earlier, and we have a process in place where we're going to be going to the legislative e-board here in a couple of weeks to request match funds for this first year of the program. When match sources are confirmed, ODOE will provide information on the use of these funds. It's possible, for instance, that more than $10 million will end up being available for grant awards after incorporating this match, but it's yet to be determined what the match funds would look like. There's also a note on the federal funds. There's a limitation that no more than 5% of the federal funds can be used for program administration, tech assistance, and information sharing. So at minimum, 95% of those federal funds will be available as direct grant awards to utilities. There's also a small utility set aside required by the funding. The way the language is written is that a minimum amount of grant funds must be made available to small utilities equal to no less than the percentage of customers served by those utilities. So in Oregon, based on our calculations, this minimum would be set at 26% based on the share of customers served by our consumer and utilities who meet the definition of small utilities by the definition provided. But we also note that on a basis of megawatt hour sales, these utilities, consumer and utilities, deliver 36% of the state's sales. So our proposal, in recognition of this minimum set-aside requirement and in recognition that many of the areas served by our consumer and utilities were severely impacted by wildfire, we're proposing a 40% set-aside of funds for consumer and utilities and the remaining 60% for investor and utilities. Next slide, please. So to achieve these objectives that I've outlined, we'll run a provisional year one program that is also streamlined and easy to administer. We have a proposed approach to establish 2 rounds of funding, a priority round and then a general round. Our proposal is that only projects that meet the criteria defined for the priority round will be eligible to apply for funding when the program opens. After that priority round closes, should funding remain, we will hold a general round with fewer restrictions. So this will allow us to prioritize projects that deliver significant community benefits without designing a competitive scoring process for year one. So how will a project qualify for the priority round? We're proposing 3 pathways, each with a mechanism to allow ODOE to determine clearly whether a project is in or out. So one priority will focus on wildfire, the second, disadvantaged communities, and a third around state emergency coordination operations. Next slide, please. So here I provide a little more detail around some of these criteria, and I'll get into some visuals and maps on the slides ahead. To apply for the priority round, a project must satisfy one of the following criteria. Here we'll take a look first at wildfire. So to qualify as a wildfire project, we're proposing a multi-step process. First, that a utility applicant must identify the project as being in a high wildfire risk area. So for example, is it identified in the utility's wildfire plans? And second, the project must be located on a statewide map related to wildfire that's identified either having been impacted by recent wildfires or at high risk of wildfire. So in the next couple of slides, I'll show some of these maps to give you a sense of what we're proposing and how this looks on an actual map. Next slide, thanks. So the first screen we're proposing to use, here are areas that were eligible for individual assistance related to the FEMA disaster declaration related to the Labor Day wildfires. So the counties shaded in red on this map would qualify for individual assistance. And what we're proposing here is that this be one of the eligibility screens that you can qualify under for the wildfire screen in the priority round. So you can see here there were 8 counties that met this requirement. Next slide, please. But then we also acknowledge that plenty of areas of the state that haven't been recently impacted by wildfire are still at very high risk of wildfire. So what I'm showing here is a map from the Oregon Explorer that shows areas of the state at high wildfire risk. And I show you there how you can find this particular layer. We recognize there may be questions about this particular data set and whether it's the appropriate data set to use for this purpose. So on that, we certainly welcome feedback. Again, what we strive to do here is identify an existing data source that can help us to direct funds to areas at high risk of wildfire in a way that allows us to decide whether a project is in or out and eligible for funding. So keep in mind the areas in red on this map. Just take a mental image of that as we flip to the next slide. Next slide, please. So what we have here, what we're trying to do is take the more granular data on the previous map and identify some existing boundaries that exist that more or less align with those high wildfire risk areas of the state. So what we've identified here are provided by the Oregon Department of Forestry. They're forest protection districts. So we've identified several forest protection districts that generally align with those areas of high risk for wildfire as identified on the previous map. So what we're really trying to do is translate that wildfire assessment into a binary screen. So the proposal is what we would take this map here of these wildfire forest protection districts plus the counties that were eligible for individual assistance through FEMA from a previous recent wildfire, and that would be combined onto a single map that ODOE would host, and your project must be located in one of those areas to be eligible for the priority round related to wildfire. Next slide, please. In addition to the wildfire screen, we also propose that projects that benefit disadvantaged communities be eligible for the priority round. So similar to the wildfire eligibility, we again propose a multi-step process here. The project must be located in an area on the map as identified by one of 2 tools provided by USDOE, which again I'll show in a moment on some slides. And the utility applicant will need to submit a community engagement addendum to demonstrate the project has community support and a robust plan for continued engagement. So what will this addendum entail? We don't have the details yet. It's something we're still thinking through. But what we're attempting to do here is avoid a check the box exercise where a project that lacks community interest and support qualifies as a project that benefits a disadvantaged community simply by its location on the map. But now let's take a look at some of those maps. Next slide, please. So here's one tool identified by the USDOE. This is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that was developed by the White House. The link is provided here if you're interested in taking a look at this map, which is interactive. You can zoom in. And I'm noting here, the blue areas visible in the statewide view only really show a part of the picture. I've zoomed in here to show you the Rogue Valley so you can better understand that really when you zoom in, it's much more granular. Next slide, please. And the other tool recommended by USDOE was created by the department's Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. Similar to the previous tool, if you zoom in, you'll see more areas qualify and it gets more granular. So again, our proposal here would be taking both of these data layers, overlapping them onto a single map layer to determine eligibility for the disadvantaged communities criteria for the priority round of this program. Okay, so we've gone through a lot of information here. I wanted to take a pause and see if there are any questions. Looks like there's maybe some questions coming in.
There are. Thanks, Adam. The first was from Brooke about whether a wildfire risk evaluation was based on the utilities risk assessments and wildfire mitigation plans. I think you might have covered that, but Brooke, if you had a follow-up question, we're happy to take you off mute. And then the other one was from Jennifer Jolly asking about why ODOE was proposing to limit to wildfire if the IIJA is focused on an all hazards approach and questioning whether it was inconsistent. I think, Adam, you covered this a little bit in your earlier slide about focus for year one and openness for other hazards in subsequent years. But if you wanted to reiterate any points there, and then I'll tee up Tracy's question after you're done, Adam.
Sure. So I'll start with the first. So what we're trying to do is certainly acknowledge the utilities have done a lot of work in this area, and we understand that they know where the projects are in the high risk areas in their territory, but we need a mechanism to be able to identify whether a project is in or not the priority location. So what we're trying to do is combine that utility understanding and knowledge of their own system and identify that they've already identified this project as being a location of high wildfire risk and that it meets one of these statewide mapping efforts. So we're trying to land in the right place that makes it easy to administer the program, but also recognizes the hard work utilities have already done in identifying their priorities. On the other question about multiple hazards, we'll certainly welcome the feedback here. In some of our preliminary conversations, we certainly heard a lot of interest in prioritizing wildfire investments in year one, but recognizing there's certainly a lot of interest and need for investments to address multiple hazards, and certainly anticipate that in future years for sure. But certainly welcome to hear more feedback and input on that.
Great. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tracy, but I'll, as she's getting off mute, I'll just put what she had in the chat or verbalize it. She was asking if they're in a high risk area, but not a high risk utility according to their plans, if they would still be eligible. For example, they're a low risk utility in the center surrounded on all sides by high risk utilities. So Adam, you might want to address that, and I think we can take Tracy off mute in case you want to discuss it.
Yeah, and I'd be curious, Tracy, which utility you're with. I didn't catch that if someone mentioned it, but and it looks like we're having technical issues trying to unmute folks. But
there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm with Springfield Utility Board, so
Great.
we are in we're landlocked service territory,
Sure.
as you know, so low risk by nature, but we're surrounded by all the high risk utilities. So while we're in that highlighted red zone that you've got, we don't have the same requirements to take care of wildfire mitigation. So, but we do have some that would fall under the scope of wildfire. So would we still be eligible then to participate?
I don't see why not. I might, the way we're trying to set this up is really have it set up based on some binary data layers from the state. We recognize, they may not be ideal, but certainly Lane County, including Springfield, was severely impacted by the 2020 wildfires and shows up in some of those other areas. So
that's good to know, because while our plans are not high risk per se, because we are insulated by the others, we still are impacted by those that we surround. So I just didn't know, because it mentions the plans, but yeah.
And admittedly, I think in an ideal world, we'd like to be able to competitively score applications, but given the complexity and the diversity of investment types, we don't want to rush into that without thinking it through. So we'd like to think that through more with stakeholder feedback over the next year in anticipation of years 2 through 5. And it looks like, Ruchi, do we have other questions?
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, from Tucker, he was wondering if he was understanding correctly that a project has to be located in an area that is both on the FEMA qualifying map and within a forest protection district.
No, I was proposing there, and this is sorry for the little bit of confusion with all the maps. I was proposing an or there. So it'd be sort of a combination of what I'm trying to capture is areas recently impacted plus areas at high risk. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of overlap in those two areas, but the areas at high risk is a little bit more expansive than those that have been recently impacted. So that was my thinking behind that. But again, certainly open for feedback and looking for feedback as you think about this approach.
Great. Thanks, Adam. There was another question about community engagement and whether the bulk of these types of technical utility hardening projects is appropriate with community engagement, and if we could explain a little bit more about what that could entail. And I see Janine came off mute. Maybe she wants to talk about that one.
Yeah, thanks, Ruchi, and thanks for the question, Jennifer. This is an area we'd love to work with folks on. And as Adam said during the presentation, really what we're trying to do is make sure this isn't a check the box exercise, and that projects that come forward as benefiting disadvantaged communities and working with disadvantaged communities, there's a way that the applicant can demonstrate that. So we're open to feedback on how an applicant can demonstrate that they benefit and they work with disadvantaged communities as described by the U.S. Department of Energy. We're contemplating developing an addendum, as it says, that sort of guides you through some questions to be able to demonstrate how you've worked with those communities. And we probably won't have the details of that ironed out before we submit this application, but look forward to working on those before we start distributing the money or putting out the application details. And I'd welcome Adam or Jen weighing in if you have anything to add.
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that. Anything? I see Jen just came off.
Yeah, so I will just add that as part of the Biden-Harris administration's emphasis on the Justice 40 initiative, it is the federal goal that 40% of the funds under this program benefit disadvantaged communities or tribal communities. And so this is part of our understanding of the initial guidance that has been put out from the federal administration of how to best engage with these communities to make sure the benefits flow towards.
Great, thank you. Another question came in from Joshua about whether there is potential overlap with eligibility for ODOE's state-funded Community Renewable Energy Grant Program in combination with this federal funding opportunity, and if so, whether there might be challenges in project planning and scope due to the two funding streams and their specific requirements, and whether ODOE could assist with coordinating that. I'll start, but would welcome Adam and others to jump in with this one. There is maybe some overlap in some areas, but we don't currently have a role in assisting with coordinating that. However, we do have a legislative concept and a funding request in to be considered probably in the 2023 session to create an navigator program position that might be able to help with that. Adam, do you want to speak to any of the overlap and eligibility that might be the case?
I have not given too much thought to that, and I see, I think Janine may have something to add on that.
Yeah, thank you. There is certainly some overlap in some of the types of projects. I did want to point out that there's one big difference, which is if you go back to the list of eligible activities shown earlier, one of the things that can't be funded with this funding, this federal funding, is electricity generation. And the Community Renewable Energy Grant Program is specifically for energy generation. There may be some overlap with the planning grants that we can look to explore in future years. And certainly we do want to help utilities and other applicants navigate some of that overlap, but it's not a clean overlap, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's great. I do think that there might be some opportunity to think about that question a little bit more with the advisory committee as well. So I think it's a really great idea, Joshua, that we would love to explore with you.
I also want to add here, Ruchi, and I don't know if Jen Center might want to add some detail, but we recognize there's a little bit of confusion in the federal language around microgrids.
Mm-hmm.
So as Janine mentioned, there is an explicit exclusion of, and I forget the exact language, it was on a slide earlier, but large scale generation and it's not entirely clear what they're intending to exclude there, because on the eligible list they do include microgrids, which would seem to include some types of generation. So there's a lot of interest in getting some more guidance from USDOE on exactly what's in and what's out in their mind in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that as we learn more from USDOE, we're happy to share that and maybe have that be incorporated in the advisory committee process for subsequent years. But we have not heard back on that question yet. Another question that came in is from Austin Jackson. Based on the timeline, how soon will resources be available for utilities to apply for funding? I saw Jen come on. I'm not sure if Jen or Adam want to try to take that one.
Oh.
I can attempt. It's a little difficult to predict. So from the first step, the state needs to submit our application on September 30th to the U.S. Department of Energy. The federal government will then review our application and potentially negotiate an award agreement with us. That process could take as little as 2 weeks to as much as 3 or 4 months. And after that time that the grant agreement is in place, then we'll be able to start our efforts to prepare an application cycle, which I anticipate will take a minimum of a few months before we're able to open up an application process from there. So if I had to provide an approximate guess, I'd say it most likely won't be available for a minimum of 6 months to even apply. And then there will also be an approval process, both from ODOE's technical review of projects and selections, but also of the federal U.S. Department of Energy that will have to do an additional layer of review before any project is able to be authorized to get going and start making the investments out there.
Great. Thanks, Jen. And Austin, we'll put in the chat the link of where you can sign up for email updates. We have a checkbox for federal funding where we'll make sure that we'll send out the information of when applications are available through that list, as well as other mechanisms. Another question I think probably for Jen came in from Alec about whether you could speak to the 5% administrative cost of approximately $500,000 in the first year to support.
Yeah, so part of the requirements that will be on the Oregon Department of Energy is negotiating the grant agreement with our federal partners. And then once that's in place, we'll have to set up a process to identify the awards, to monitor the financials, to provide the reporting both from our grantees and also from the state level back to the federal government. We'll also be working on our plan for future years with some of those administrative funds and technical assistance funds. So not only launching what's going to hopefully hit the ground in that very first year, but planning for the future with those funding during that first year as well.
Great. There are a few comments in the chat that I'll just vocalize about distributed renewable energy microgrids and the earlier conversation we had about generation, as well as a comment around community engagement and applicants working with union apprenticeship programs is a critical piece. And it looks like Ryan is interested in working with folks on that. Thanks, Ryan. And then 2 other questions, and then I think we'll go back to the slide and pause again later. The first is from Harney Electric Cooperative. What happens when supplies are not available from U.S. suppliers? Also wondering if the grant process is going to be simple because of some of the smaller utilities that don't have grant writers on staff. One other plug for that Navigator program that we're trying to put together is hopefully to help with that, but that won't likely become available until later. I'm not sure, Jen, if you have something on the suppliers piece. I know that's been an area of concern that's come up in other places.
Yes, so the Build America, Buy America provisions will apply. So in general, the equipment will need to be produced within America. There are limited waivers that may be possible, but that will have to be issued by the federal US Department of Energy. So it may, there's several different ways that can be done, but it will really come down to the very specific item and how much that might increase the cost of the overall project, and various other factors that gets really specific once we start talking about which type of waiver potentially.
Great, thanks, Jen. And I think that we would like to keep it as simple as possible, but you're hearing a lot of requirements from Jen. So if you have feedback on how it could be more simple from our end, we'd love to hear that and try to make that part of the design. Last one from Jennifer is just confirming, I think, something that you said, Jen, about whether the federal government can alter the application submitted by the state and if that typically does occur.
They do have the ability to negotiate, and that is a part of the federal process. Whether or not it's likely to happen, I'm really not sure, since this is a brand new federal program. We do have some other federal programs where it is an extreme rarity, and others where it is a common annual occurrence. And so since this is a brand new program, I'm just not sure what the federal government's approach may be in interacting with us on this one.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to pause again for questions a little bit later, but let the team go through the rest of the slide deck, and please keep the questions coming in the chat. It's really helpful to log those as you have them.
Great, thank you. And I think we went back a couple slides, one more. Yeah, and so just before I do this, just to summarize, since we went through a lot of material there, sort of the vision as we're proposing it is that there will be two data layers mapped, one around wildfire and then one around disadvantaged communities. So the vision is that you'd have a combination of the layers, the maps you just saw, that would make up a single wildfire layer and a single disadvantaged community layer that we would make available before the program gets going. So yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we do plan a priority round where only those projects that satisfy the eligibility requirements on the previous slides can apply. But assuming funds still remain, we do then plan to hold a general round with fewer restrictions, where projects could be located anywhere in the state, and we'd really be looking to the utility applicant to identify which hazard or hazards the project is designed to mitigate. And we'd be looking for the utility to identify the project in a previously published plan. So something like a utility or community energy or resilience plan, a local natural hazard mitigation plan, a wildfire plan, et cetera. So why are we proposing it this way? Again, we're proposing the structure this way in year one to ensure we can commit all the funds allocated to Oregon via the formula grant. We don't want to leave anything left on the table there that's been allocated to the state. So that's the idea behind scoping a general round in this way after the priority round. Next slide, please. And so here's the last slide for me on the specifics of our proposed provisional approach for year one. As I think I've already made clear, but I'm not sure if I said explicitly, we're proposing to make direct awards for year one. The funding leaves significant discretion to the states in this regard, either to do direct awards, have competitive solicitations, green banks, et cetera. But we're proposing a direct award approach. We also propose that the utility applicant will be required to demonstrate compliance with the eligibility requirements, subject to an eligibility and technical review by ODOE staff. If more funds are requested than are available, ODOE will identify a process for making awards that may include first come, first served, a randomized lottery, or some combination thereof. And you'll see more details about our thinking there in the draft narrative. Match requirements. So this was mentioned earlier by Jen, but the state's required to do a 15% match of total federal funds to access the state formula allocation. And then in addition to that, each utility applicant will have its own match requirement. Based on our preliminary calculations, we anticipate that this will be a 100% match required for our IOUs and a 1/3 match for our COUs. And then the last element here I'm going to cover is around maximum awards. And again, this is an area where I really am looking for some feedback. We're trying to balance here having sufficient dollars available per award so that we can make meaningful investments for individual projects with the total number of awards that we can make. So that's what we're trying to strike a balance here. So we're proposing to impose limitations on how much any utility can receive in that priority round. For the IOUs, we're really looking to do it on a proportionate basis based on the share of customers served by each investor-owned utility relative to all three of the investor-owned utilities statewide. So again, this is our preliminary calculation of these percentages is shown here on this slide. And then for consumer-owned utilities, we're proposing a maximum award amount of $400,000 per utility in the priority round. Again, I hope you understand the objectives we have here, but trying to really balance that, striking the right mix between the total dollar amount to make meaningful investments with being able to award a certain number of awards that a certain threshold of utilities can capture an award. So that's all I have here, unless we want to pause for more questions. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Jen Center.
Great. I think we'll go ahead and cover the metrics.
Actually, Jen, before jumping into that, there was a question for Adam, I think, on the small utility from Jennifer that wanted some clarification on the assumptions. So in that one, there's a $400,000 cap for small utilities that you can see on the last bullet on the slide. And she was thinking that only 10 of the 37 consumer-owned utilities would be eligible for a maximum 400,000 grant. And so we're wondering about some of the assumptions that ODOE might have had in coming to that number about participation and eligibility in year one.
Sure. Yeah, and again, totally welcomed to hear feedback on this. I think it's really, we're trying to balance how to balance this issue we have here. But so you're right. That's about the math we were thinking is roughly 10 awards to be made, but recognizing that wouldn't be all consumer utilities being able to get an award. But again, if we were to ensure that every consumer utility got an award, we'd be talking about much smaller dollar amounts. So we're trying to strike the balance and get that right. So please get us your feedback. And I also, we did look a little bit about, should we look at kind of percentages of customers served by our consumer-owned utilities? But I think, as everyone on the call is probably aware, there's really such a huge diversity for some really small municipal utilities to some fairly good size co-ops and PUDs, that you'd have a really big spread there, with some utilities getting a really extremely small dollar amount that might not really allow for a meaningful investment. So anyway, well, welcome to hear your ideas on this.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And thanks, Jason and Brittany, for adding to the conversation in the chat about the small utility award and the idea of maybe getting together with other utilities. Go ahead, Jen.
Great. So Adam covered some of our initial objectives, especially during year one, but underneath those objectives, we have some proposed metrics, and it's our hope that these metrics would help us at the Oregon Department of Energy determine and assess how well these investments are meeting these objectives. And so these are just some of the proposed metrics. We are certainly open to feedback as to whether or not these really help us measure those overarching objectives, and if there's a better way to frame these or define these or consider these, we certainly welcome your feedback into that. Many of these metrics would be incorporated into subrecipient grant agreements, because that would be part of how we would be able to determine if our investments are serving these purposes. So just covering some of the types of metrics, we have metrics under the objective of wildfire risk mitigation and benefits to disadvantaged communities, or the 9 federally recognized tribes. We also have metrics around supporting immediate investments that provide those community benefits as soon as possible, and metrics that help us examine whether or not we're investing in projects that meet strong labor protections and standards. In addition to that, we have some metrics set around our investments and engagements with disadvantaged communities and the 9 federally recognized tribes. as well as metrics that can help us evaluate our progress as we look to the future and consider our work with an advisory committee to design additional objectives, metrics, and criteria for years 2 through 5 of the program that can support an all hazards approach that's informed by the state energy security plan and key stakeholders to help us prioritize those projects that are identified by and located within the disadvantaged and/or tribal communities. Okay, so with that, we can see if there are any additional questions before we move on to discussing the future of a Grid Resilience Advisory Committee.
There's one question that just came in from Rick about how can the quote any hazard in a utility service territory be adapted to encourage transmission and sub-transmission resilience, and a kind of comment about the council and Northern Grid folks not considering resilience category events.
Adam, would you?
I was trying to get myself on mute there. Rick always likes to ask hard questions, so thank you, Professor Williams, for that. That's a good question. I will take that under consideration. I'd be interested to see what the utilities are thinking in their investments in this regard. But
yeah, I was thinking that too, Adam, that we may not be in the position to know that level of specificity, but the utilities could help us with their interpretation through their applications. Thanks, Rick. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions right now.
Actually, I think we have a hand up. Looks like
good.
Has a question. So you can unmute, Jen.
Going back to the $40,000 or $400,000 cap on the small utility projects, and just thinking about the number of utilities and the number of projects, if people can fit themselves into these kind of narrow bands for year one and, develop a project that fits. If you have more than 10 small utilities applying for the 40% set aside for the small utilities, are you proposing to have like some sort of way to reduce the grant award on a pro rata basis? Like if you get 20 COUs that meet all the criteria, because you're not going to prioritize them. If they meet the criteria, you're going to fund them. I'm just trying to figure out how do you intend to deal with that? Because I do think there will be a lot of demand. People will try and fit themselves into these narrow bands, given the opportunity that this presents.
thanks, Jennifer. I totally hear you on that. And we're kind of in a tight spot of having only so much funding available. And I agree with you. I think there's a huge appetite for making these kind of investments. So what we've laid out in the draft narrative is that we would have for some defined period of time after the funding opens. I think we have 5 business days in there currently, but could make that longer. That anyone who submits a completed application in that first week or something, we could randomize applications. Otherwise, have it be first come, first served. But we recognize that's there are some downsides of that, but we also could think about ways to prioritize utilities that don't get funded in, say, the priority round in future years of funding, or something like that. But it's something we're definitely struggling with because, as we know, there's a lot of need in the state and a lot of interest from our utilities in making these kind of investments. So. We welcome feedback on thinking about how to do this in a way that makes the most sense and is the most equitable.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, we can move along through our final slides before public comment.
Great, thanks, Jen. I think I'm on tap for this one, and it's mercifully quiet on my roof at the moment. So as we've talked about, we have an approach for year one that is more narrow and limited, trying to make sure we get the money out the door in year one. But we do want to have a conversation with people on this call and others about our approach for years 2 through 5. We will likely want to take a different approach, broader than just wildfire and infrastructure hardening, and centered more on the resilience needs of the state, including environmental justice communities. We want to take the time to explore what the term community benefits really means and how to prioritize projects that provide those benefits and that ensure that we have all the right voices at the table. We also want to make sure this funding is aligned with Oregon's Energy Security Plan, which our agency is also responsible for pulling together over the next year or so. To that end, we are planning to establish and convene a Grid Resilience Advisory Committee to help us answer those questions. We don't have the timing and details ironed out on that yet, so stay tuned. The online portal that we have on our website that Ruchi has put links into the chat includes some prompting questions to help us design this committee and the process. So please feel free to weigh in there or during today's comment time on ways that we can structure and support an advisory committee to help meet these objectives. Next slide, please. So today is one of the many ways that you can engage with ODOE on this proposal, and this slide outlines some additional ways to get and stay involved. So as I mentioned, you can submit comments on the online portal. Although in terms of this draft application, please note that the timeline is pretty tight with the deadline of this Friday so that we can finalize these details, have what we need to testify in front of the e-board, and then submit the application to the U.S. Department of Energy on time. You can let us know if you're interested in engaging with that advisory committee to help us refine the approach for future years. You can partner with your local utility on an application. And you can check out our job announcements. We have the job announcements all posted on our website, and we'd love for you to come work with us and help us figure this out. Next slide, please. So next steps. As I mentioned, in late September, we'll be presenting to the Legislative Emergency Board. We have to seek permission to apply for this grant and then request general funds for that state match for the first year of the program. We will then submit our application to the U.S. Department of Energy by September 30th. And as Jen talked about, that will start a negotiation with US DOE on our application. Keep in mind, we don't know how that's going to work, but the details could change as we work with US Department of Energy. We anticipate finalizing those conversations and receiving funding from US DOE towards the end of this year or early next. And once that happens, we can start putting together a funding opportunity announcement and application details for utilities who will be applying to the state for this funding. But I just want to make sure everyone knows it may take a while to get all those details settled and the funding flowing. And finally, stay tuned for more information on the Grid Resilience Advisory Committee. We're going to review the ideas and feedback we receive on how best to support this committee, and we'll be looking at available funding and capacity to inform our approach. Next slide, please. So now we've reached the time for public comments. We really appreciate the questions and comments that we've already seen in the chat and asked with raised hands. And this is another opportunity for you to make a comment or ask a question. Please either use the chat or raise your hand so we can call on you and take you off mute. Remember that if you're on the phone, you can press *6 to raise your hand and *3 to unmute yourself when we call on you, and Stacy will unmute you from our end. So now that you have a understanding, hopefully a little bit better understanding of the approach we are proposing for year one, please let us know what you think. And then I also want to remind you that our website includes a portal where you can elaborate on this. And that portal also has specific questions that we would appreciate your feedback on to help us refine our approach. I'll just ask folks to maybe keep their comments to under 3 minutes so that everyone has a chance to ask any questions they have. And with that, I will ask Ruchi whether, or Stacy, whether they see any hands raised or any questions in the chat.
No questions in the chat so far.
Okay, we will pause here and have some awkward silences while people think about their questions or figure out how to raise their hands. Okay, we'll give folks a few more minutes. This is the end of our presentation, so
Oh, I see a hand from Tucker.
good. Thanks, Ruchi.
Maybe.
Oh yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. This is Tucker Billman with OTEC. Good to see you all, and thanks for the overview. I appreciate it. You answered all of my questions. I actually just kind of wanted to make a statement, just going back to the piece about how you'll handle, the potential for more applications than you have funding. And I know y'all are still considering that. I think, a number of the ideas you suggested work well. And I know it kind of goes without saying, but that's obviously something we're just kind of keying in on very closely. So when you do make a determination on how specifically you plan to handle that, please just be sure to communicate that out to us so we know how to be best prepared for that, which I'm sure you will. But I just wanted to make that plug because that was a question that came up in a couple internal meetings this morning. So I wanted to make sure I'd said my part, but otherwise, good presentation. I don't think I have any other questions at this point. So thank you.
Thanks, Tucker. We will do our best to communicate often on all of this.
A question came in from Jenny about the anticipated timeline for submission again. We want to maybe go back to that.
Yep, if we want to go back a slide or two, there's the next steps, but Jenny, the main thing to keep in mind is that we need to submit our application to U.S. Department of Energy by September 30th. After that, who knows?
Yeah, it sounds like Jenny was wondering more about the submissions from utilities, and that's similar to, I think, a response that Jen provided earlier, where unfortunately we don't know. There's a little bit of unknown after the application goes in on the 30th, where US DOE will review and potentially negotiate that with us. But I'll put in the chat the link to where you can sign up for our email updates. There's a checkbox you can click for federal funding, and we'll make sure to keep folks apprised as we know more about that timeline.
Looks like Jennifer Jolly has her hand up again.
Thank you. I just wanted to check in on the future years of the program. Is it your sense that you would develop through this advisory committee some method to rank or prioritize projects? Or are you seeing something similar? Because I thought I heard that if you didn't receive in round one, that perhaps you would be first on the list in the second phase of this program. So I want to ensure that could be the case. But like you wouldn't be displaced by a new ranking methodology in the round two, for example.
So there's, sorry, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to answer in a sec, but there's two different things here. There's round one and round two of year one. Round one has those three criteria and then a general round. And then there's also a whole new set of objectives and methods that we are planning to work with that advisory committee to design and create for years 2 through 5. And now I'll turn it back to Adam.
Yeah, my answer was going to be probably unsatisfactory in a lot of ways, but I was just going to suggest we'd like feedback. I mean, I'd really be curious for those on the call and those who can fill out the comment portal, if you have suggestions on this, to let us know. Because I think that would be good to hear sort of different ways to think about doing this.
Because it seems like we may not have a round two, I guess is what I'm thinking in this initial 1 year. yeah, given how it's been designed. But so if that's the case, I would just want to ensure that those utilities that weren't able to get a project in round one, came to the top of the list in the outer years, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That should definitely be something discussed for years 2 through 5 in terms of the advisory committee about whether or not it makes sense to prioritize utilities that haven't received funding in prior years. I think that's definitely worth a conversation. Thanks for raising that.
Thank you.
And I see that Janine Parisi has her hand up.
It seemed like reading the information that the period of performance for the first round was pretty flexible, but then I'm also hearing a little bit of a sense of urgency to get projects, they show that community benefit sooner, so kind of that shovel readiness. So can you speak a little bit more in terms of the, what ODOE is looking for in terms of projects that are ready and ideal completion, timeline from start to finish once the application's in?
I think there's I guess I have a couple of different thoughts on this, and I welcome Jen's input as well. So I think one, in terms of, I think there is an interest in on our part and USDOE overall in getting projects that can deliver community benefits in the near term. So we want to kind of balance, we're not, I don't think the intent here is to fund projects that are sort of a glimmer in a utility's eye, right? We'd like to have projects that are sort of more in the near term. What exactly that looks like, I'm not sure exactly. So I'd look for feedback on that as well, whether it's, is it in a capital improvement plan? Is it in, I don't know what that looks like exactly. But then on the other side of that, also, there's the language from USDOE on sort of what the timelines look like in terms of performance and that sort of thing. So I'd turn it over to Jen Center to add to this.
Yeah, I can help add a little bit more information. So as part of this process, ODOE will open up an application cycle and issue our intent to make awards to certain entities that apply. And from that time that we make our intent to award, we can't actually execute an award agreement quite at that phase. We'll have to work with the entity to gather up additional documentation that will then need to go as a package to the U.S. Department of Energy, where they'll review as part of their process. Included in that process, depending on the exact scope of the project, may be requirements. There will be an environmental questionnaire that will need to be completed for all projects that are funded through this. And so a minimum project should be ready to complete an environmental questionnaire to help with the basic level of National Environmental Policy Act review. And with that understanding that sometimes if a project requires additional analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, it could take quite a while to move through before the federal government will grant the full approval for us to move forward with a final award agreement. So ideally, we're seeking projects that by the time they apply, they're able to complete that environmental questionnaire, and we'll be able to help provide additional information on what that looks like when we're ready to launch an application cycle. We also, at least in our proposal, have proposed that projects should be ready to begin the work within 2 years of that final award, and would ideally be completed within 4 years of that time frame. The exact details of the timing will depend on the precise negotiations with the U.S. Department of Energy as well. And we do know there could be supply chain disruptions or workforce shortages that could delay projects. So ideally, a project should have some level of pre-planning done so that we're able to answer the questions that the U.S. Department of Energy will ask to determine if the project is really ready to move forward. And so that would probably be what we'd be seeking.
Thank you so much for that. Is that questionnaire already available, so like one could take a look at it and just see what kind of questions we'd need to be ready to answer? Because I'm feeling like thing that requires excavation starts triggering NEPA. So replacement projects, you know, those can just, you know, get bogged down really quickly, although they could be really great projects. You know, anything near rivers, which a lot of our high fire risk zone is right along a river. But anyway, if you have that questionnaire handy, that'd be helpful.
Yes, we do have it available. The U.S. Department of Energy has produced that, so we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, it looks like we have Tucker has a question. If we can unmute Tucker, please. Stacy?
Yep. Can you hear me? Awesome. Just piggybacking off that conversation, I remember one question that was asked, going back to the Community Renewable Energy Program, about kind of timing of when a project can start in relation to the award. And I realize you just talked through kind of the environmental implications of that, but if you have a shovel-ready project, and I don't know how many utilities this will be impacted or will be impacted by this, but if you have a shovel-ready project, you're informed that you will be awarded a certain amount of funds. You do go through that NEPA process, and you're ready to begin building, but the funds haven't quite made it from ODOE into the utility yet. Does the utility need to sit and wait to complete that project? And the reason I ask that is because I remember in the same conversation with the solar array, we were concerned about supply chain issues and whether or not we would be able to get the products if we didn't pull the trigger quickly enough. And so I could just anticipate that being a question one of our engineers asked, and I wanted to run it by you all.
Yeah, I can help a little bit with that. So project costs will most likely not be eligible until the full award agreement between ODOE and the recipient is fully executed. But after that, these funds will most likely run on a cost reimbursement basis. There may be potential for limited advance costs at the beginning, but that's something we would need to discuss with the U.S. Department of Energy before any commitments could be made. So generally, it would need to be a cost reimbursement where the grant recipient would invoice ODOE to then receive the funds.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any hands raised, but we can give it another minute. All right, well, Jen, can you go to the final slide, please? Thank you. That takes us to the end of our presentation, and it looks like we don't have any other hands raised or questions in the chat. So I really want to thank people for coming today, for your great questions and comments, and encourage you to visit that comment portal, read the prompting questions, which are areas that we are really looking for feedback on, but also tell us your general thoughts on the draft proposed narrative. And go ahead and sign up for emails if you'd like to make sure we keep you in the loop about this moving forward in terms of what we hear back from the U.S. Department of Energy when we have the funding opportunities ready to go. Again, the deadline for sending us your feedback on the online portal is this Friday. It's been open for it will have been open for about a week and a half, and quick turnaround because we do need to get all the details ironed out before we make the submittal to U.S. Department of Energy. And
start engaging your communities in good local projects. So thanks again so much for being here. We really appreciate your feedback and look forward to partnering with you to help improve the resilience of our electric grid here in the state.